She had only 3 seconds to decide. 3 seconds to either stay invisible and keep her job, or speak up and destroy the biggest lie ever told. This is the story of Elena, and it is also, in ways she never could have anticipated, the story of what happens when a person who has spent their entire life being overlooked becomes the only thing that matters to someone who used to overlook everyone. I want to tell you this story slowly because it deserves that. It deserves the kind of attention that the people in it were not always given. So stay with me. Elena Vasquez was 26 years old and worked the night shift at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle. She had been there for 3 years. 3 years of quiet corridors and fluorescent lights and the particular rhythm of a hospital after midnight, when the visitors have gone home and the building settles into something almost peaceful. She wore the standard blue uniform of the housekeeping staff, and she moved through the hospital the way people in her position learned to move, efficiently, unobtrusively, in the careful margins of the space that the more visible people occupied. She was not invisible exactly. She was simply not seen, which is a different thing, and one that she had made a kind of peace with. She was paying for her sister Maria's nursing degree. This is important to understand about Elena, not as a detail, but as the architecture of her life. Maria was 22, brilliant, and had a full scholarship that covered tuition, but left everything else: housing, books, food, the small but real costs of being a student, uncovered. Elena had stepped into that gap without being asked, without making a production of it, without ever mentioning it to Maria in a way that would create debt between them. She worked nights because the differential pay was better. She ate lunch from a thermos she brought from home. She did not complain, because complaining required a kind of energy she preferred to spend on other things. Have you ever felt completely invisible to the people you serve? Not disliked, not mistreated, just unseen, in the particular way that service workers understand being unseen, where your presence is acknowledged only in the sense that your absence would be noticed. That was the texture of Elena's daily life, and she had organized herself around it with a grace that was its own kind of dignity. The VIP wing of Harborview was on the 4th floor, and Elena's route took her through it twice a night. The rooms there were larger and quieter, the carpeting different from the linoleum in the rest of the building, the lighting warmer. The patients in the VIP wing were different from the patients on other floors, not in their suffering being the great equalizer, but in the infrastructure around them. The rooms had names, not numbers. Flowers arrived in arrangements that required 2 hands to carry. The nurses knocked before entering. Room 412 received its occupant on a Tuesday in October. His name was Marcus Webb. He was 43 years old, the CEO of a technology firm whose products Elena had never used and whose name she had never heard before she mopped the floor outside his room on his first night there. He had been in a car accident on the 520 bridge during a rainstorm. His car had been struck from behind and spun into the barrier, and the impact had done something to his optic nerves that the doctors described, in the language of medicine that obscures as much as it explains, as a traumatic bilateral visual disruption. In language that everyone could understand, Marcus Webb could not see. She heard about this the way she heard about most things, in fragments, overheard at the nurse's station, pieced together from the clipped professional conversations of people who had forgotten she was in the room. The damage was significant. The prognosis was uncertain. There was a surgery being discussed, a specialist being brought in from Boston, a recovery process that might, if they were fortunate, restore some or most of his vision. Or might not. What she did not hear about from overheard conversations, what she observed directly with her own eyes on the 3rd night of Marcus's stay, was the fiancée. Vanessa arrived that evening in a coat that cost more than Elena made in a month, with the particular energy of someone who has already performed grief in the elevator and is now navigating its practical implications. She was beautiful in the specific, maintained way of people for whom beauty is a professional asset and who treat it accordingly. She sat with Marcus for approximately 40 minutes. Elena, cleaning the room across the hall, could not hear everything, but she could hear enough. The tone of the conversation. The questions Vanessa asked, which had a quality of auditing rather than comforting. The silences. When Vanessa left, she walked past Elena in the corridor without any acknowledgement whatsoever. Not the slight nod that some visitors offered, not the brief eye contact that others managed. She simply passed by, pulling on her gloves, and Elena watched her go to the elevator and understood, in the wordless way of someone who has spent years reading the rooms of powerful people, that Marcus Webb was now alone in a way that had nothing to do with his visitor having left. She should have continued her route, she knew that. The VIP wing had its protocols, and the patients in it had their privacy, and her job was the floors and the surfaces and the quiet competence of her work, and none of it included going into room 412 at 11 o'clock at night because she had a feeling. She went in anyway. He was lying in the bed with his face turned toward the window, though the window meant nothing to him now. The room was dim. She could hear his breathing, not distressed exactly, but effortful in the specific way of someone who is holding themselves together through the sheer force of not giving in to what they are feeling. She stood in the doorway for a moment, uncertain, her cleaning cart in the corridor behind her. She crossed the room and sat in the chair beside his bed. He turned his head toward her presence. She could see the adjustment, the slight orienting of someone who is learning, in real time, to navigate a world without visual anchors. She reached out and took his hand. He didn't pull away. He didn't speak. After a moment, his grip tightened, just slightly, in the automatic response of a person who has been alone for longer than they knew and has just found contact. She stayed for an hour that first night. She did not tell him her name. She did not tell him what she did, or why she was there, or how she had come to be sitting beside his bed at 11 in the evening, holding his hand. When he asked, in a voice roughened by days of disuse, who she was, she said only that she was someone who had heard him and come. He accepted this with the particular acceptance of someone who has run out of the energy required for skepticism. She came back the following night, and the night after that. By the end of the first week, she was reading to him. She had found, in the hospital's small patient library on the second floor, a worn copy of a novel she had loved since she was a teenager, a story of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, which seemed appropriate. She read in the chair beside his bed, her voice low and steady, and he listened with his eyes closed and his hands folded on his chest, and the room had a quality of calm that neither of them fully understood. He began to talk to her, not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, in the way that people begin to talk when they have been given enough silence to feel safe in it. He talked about the accident, not the physical facts of it, which he had already processed with the doctors, but the internal experience of it, the specific terror of waking up in darkness without warning and not knowing whether the darkness was temporary or permanent. He talked about his company, about the meetings that had been moved and the calls that had been rerouted, and the whole machinery of his professional life that had continued without him, and that he found, from this distance, strangely difficult to care about in the way he had before. He talked about his childhood, about his parents, about a summer he had spent at a lake in Oregon when he was 12 that he had not thought about in 30 years, and that came to him now, in the dark, with a clarity that surprised him. He did not ask her again who she was. She had the sense that he had made a decision not to ask, that he understood, on some level he could not articulate, that the asking would change something. She was grateful for that. She was also aware, in the honest part of herself that she did not ignore, that what they were building in this room, this quiet nightly thing with no names and no explanations, could not last. At some point the surgery would happen. At some point the bandages would come off. At some point the darkness would end. She thought about stopping. She told herself more than once that she should stop, that what she was doing was against hospital protocol, that she was risking her job, that the sensible thing was to return to her cart and her route and the invisible competence of her work. She did not stop. She came back every night, and she read to him, and she held his hand, and she listened to him talk about a life that was more complicated and more lonely than the exterior of it suggested. And she felt something happening that she recognized and was frightened of and did not know how to prevent. She was falling in love with him, which was the most impractical thing she had ever done, and she did it anyway, because the heart is not always a practical instrument. He told her, one night in the third week, that her voice was the only thing he was certain of, that everything else, his vision, his company, his sense of himself as someone capable and in control, felt provisional and contingent and uncertain. But her voice, he said, was real in a way that nothing else currently was. She sat with that for a long time after she had left the room and was back in the corridor with her cart, and she did not know what to do with it except carry it carefully. The surgery was scheduled for a Thursday in November. The specialist from Boston performed it on a Wednesday morning, which Elena learned from the nurse's station as she finished her route, and which meant she did not have a chance to see Marcus before it happened, to say the things she had been composing in her head for weeks without committing to any of them. She went home after her shift and slept badly, and came back that evening not knowing what she would find. The surgery had gone well. This was what the nurses said to each other, in the clipped shorthand of good news. It went well, he's stable, we'll know more when they remove the bandages tomorrow. Elena moved through her route and came, as she always did, to the 4th floor, to the corridor outside room 412, and stood for a moment in the familiar threshold between the hallway and the room where something had happened to her that she had not expected and did not entirely know how to name. She did not go in that night. The room had an occupied quality that felt different from the previous weeks. She did not know then that Vanessa had returned, that the surgery's success had been communicated to people who had not visited during the uncertain weeks, that the particular magnetism of a man who would recover was different from the particular burden of a man who might not. She would understand this later. That night, she simply stood in the hallway for a moment and then returned to her cart. The bandages came off on Friday morning. Elena was on her shift. She was on the 3rd floor when it happened, 3 floors below and 3 corridors away, with no knowledge of what was occurring in room 412 at that moment. She would reconstruct it later, from the account of a nurse who had been present and who told her, in the careful language of someone who understands that the information they are conveying is significant. Marcus opened his eyes. The world came back to him, blurry at first, then sharpening, the way vision returns after surgery, in gradients and adjustments. The specialist checked the responses and declared the surgery successful. Marcus was going to see, and Vanessa, who had been waiting outside the room, came in. She came in with the energy of someone who has prepared for this moment. She crossed to his bed and took his hands and said, with the fluency of a person who has rehearsed this, that she had been there every night, that she had been the voice in the dark, reading to him, sitting with him, keeping him company through the worst weeks of his life. She said it with the conviction of someone who has decided that a thing is true and is committed to the performance of that truth. Marcus looked at her. He heard the voice, familiar from before the accident, from the years of their relationship, warm and polished and nothing like what he remembered. His face had an expression that the nurse later described as a kind of internal searching, as if he were listening not to what was being said, but to the quality of the saying, as if something was not matching. But he was recovering from surgery, and his eyes were still adjusting, and Vanessa was there with her hands in his and her conviction, and the confusion he felt was the kind that is easy to explain away. Drugs, disorientation, the strangeness of returning sight. He allowed himself to be uncertain. He let Vanessa's hands stay in his. He was discharged that afternoon. The paperwork was completed. The specialist gave his instructions. Vanessa organized the exit with the efficiency of someone who has decided that the role of present and loving partner is one she is now committed to performing indefinitely. A wheelchair was brought. Marcus was settled into it, still adjusting to the returned gift of sight, looking at the world with the particular attention of someone who has understood, recently and viscerally, that looking is not a thing to take for granted. The corridor outside room 412 runs the length of the fourth floor. Elena was at the far end of it, near the service elevator, with her cart. She had heard from the nurses that Marcus was being discharged. She had positioned herself, without fully admitting to herself that she was positioning herself, in a place where she might see him pass. She did not know what she would do when she saw him. She was not sure there was anything to do. She was a hospital cleaning lady who had spent 3 weeks sitting with a man in the dark, and now the dark was over, and the man was leaving with someone else's hand in his, and the correct response was probably to let that be the end of the story. Vanessa came first, arm linked through Marcus's, her coat perfect, her expression the managed warmth of someone who is aware of being watched. Marcus came beside her, moving carefully, his eyes taking in the corridor with the attention she had noticed in his face in the room. He was taller than she had imagined in those weeks of sitting beside his bed in the dark. That struck her with an absurd specificity, that she had not known how tall he was. She tried to make herself very still. The cart was beside her, laden with the equipment of her work. She gripped the handle, and then she didn't. She doesn't know, to this day, whether it was a true accident or something that her hands did without consulting her conscious mind. The tray slipped. The metal clattered against the floor with a sound that carried the length of the corridor, a sudden, sharp noise in the quiet of a hospital afternoon. She gasped and said, before she could think whether to say it, what she had been trained over 3 years to say in moments of disruption. She said, "I'm so sorry, sir." 3 words, her voice, low and unguarded in the small shock of the moment, in the register that was hers and no one else's, carrying down the corridor without any of the filters she might have applied if she had planned to speak. Marcus stopped. He stopped the way people stop when something has reached the part of them that the reasoning mind does not govern. Not a considered pause, not a conscious decision, but the full-body interruption of recognition. Vanessa kept walking a half step before she realized he was no longer moving. She turned. He stood very still for a moment. Then he turned around. Elena was on the floor, gathering the contents of the tray, not looking up, performing the focused competence of someone managing a disruption, her face toward the ground. She was aware of footsteps coming toward her. Not the quick, irritated footsteps of someone approaching to complain, but something else, slower, deliberate. She looked up. He was standing in front of her. He was looking at her with an expression that she would not be able to adequately describe afterward, though she tried more than once in the conversations that followed. It was not surprise exactly. It was recognition, and something underneath recognition, a quality of arriving somewhere that you had been trying to locate for a long time. He said, "It's you." He said, "It was always you." He said it simply, without performance, in the voice of a man who has spent 3 weeks learning to trust what he hears over what he sees, and who was now, for the first time, being given both at once. Vanessa's voice came from behind him, precise and controlled, and with an edge that cut through its own smoothness. She said his name. She said it the way people say things when they are trying to redirect attention, to reassert the architecture of a moment that is shifting away from them. He did not turn around. He reached down instead and helped Elena to her feet, and she stood in front of him in her blue uniform, with the hospital's logo on the chest and the practical shoes that her shift required. And he held her hands in both of his and looked at her face for the first time. And she looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there was nothing to say that the moment wasn't already saying. When he did speak, he turned, still holding Elena's hand, and spoke to Vanessa directly. He said that he knew her voice, the way a person knows a voice that has been the only real thing in 3 weeks of darkness, and that the voice behind him was not it, and never had been. He said the rest of it briefly, and without cruelty, because cruelty had no place in what he was feeling, and Vanessa received it the way people receive things they cannot argue with the silence that follows the exhaustion of available responses. She left. The corridor absorbed that exit without drama. The story that Elena tells afterward, in the private way that she tells it, to her sister and to a few people she trusts, is not primarily a story about Marcus's wealth, or his company, or the material ways in which everything changed. Those things changed. He paid for Maria's education, the full cost of her nursing degree, because it was the first concrete thing he asked Elena about when she finally told him everything: who she was, what she did, why she had come into his room that first night. And because paying for it was the most immediate way he knew to do something real in response to what she had done for him. The tuition was paid the following week, in full. But the part of the story she comes back to most, the part that she describes with the specificity of something she has turned over many times in her mind, is the corridor, the drop tray, the 3 words she said, the sound of footsteps coming toward her, the moment when someone who had moved through 3 years of being unseen became the only thing that a man with newly returned sight was looking at. I want to say something to you before I leave this story with you. There is a kind of beauty that only becomes visible in the dark. Not the beauty that is curated and presented and maintained for the benefit of observers, the kind that Vanessa understood and that the world Marcus had built rewarded, but the other kind. The kind that shows up at 11 o'clock at night in a hospital corridor with no announcement and no audience and sits down beside someone who is afraid and holds their hand for no reason except that the holding seems like the right thing to do. That kind of beauty does not require a title. It does not require money or the correct coat or the practiced warmth of someone performing care for an audience. It requires only the willingness to show up in the dark and be present, without expectation of credit, without the protection of an audience to witness it. Elena went into that room because she heard something in a person's breathing that she recognized. She stayed because she found, in the honest darkness of those weeks, something that the lit and organized surfaces of her daily life had not provided. She nearly said nothing in that corridor, nearly let the story end the way stories like hers so often end, with the person who did the real work disappearing back into the margins while someone else steps into the light. She dropped a tray. Her voice carried 3 words down a hallway, and someone heard her, truly heard her, for the first time. The truth has a voice. It is quieter than lies, which tend toward volume. It does not always speak at the convenient moment or in the form you might expect. But it persists. It finds its moment. And when it finally speaks, it speaks in a register that something in a person recognizes, even before the reasoning mind has caught up. Even in the dark. Perhaps especially there.